Hello, welcome to Bio 160, Fall 2022 at Australian Mountain Community College. Today we're discussing the respiratory system, which is your how you breathe, your lungs, your upper airway, and we will be completing this chapter today. So the summary sheet for this chapter will be due through Canvas by a Wednesday, November 30th, by the beginning of lecture. So because of the holiday, the summary sheet won't be due Monday like usual. It will be due next Wednesday. So what is the respiratory system? It's the gas exchange between blood and the external environment. And of course, by external environment, we mean the air that you breathe. Gas exchange actually occurs in the alveoli of the lungs, which we'll discuss in more detail later, but they're microscopic sacs or bubbles of air that are packed in tightly with the capillaries in the lung, where the gas exchange actually occurs across the alveoli and the capillary. The gases that exchanged are oxygen that goes into the lungs and into the blood through the alveoli, and carbon dioxide, which goes out of the lungs from the blood through the alveoli, and then it is expelled through your upper respiratory system back into the environment. So what are the major organs of the respiratory system? The nose is actually considered part of your respiratory system. So now that you're an anatomist and a physiologist, next time at your party, someone talks about their nose, you can tell them that's part of their respiratory system. The pharynx and larynx are actually the open cavity, the upper airway that's in your head, but behind the nose and the mouth, what we might call the back of your throat. The trachea is the airway that travels from your head down to your lungs through the neck. The bronchi are the branches that come off the trachea carrying air into the lungs. Again, the alveoli are the microscopic sacs, membranous bubbles, if you will, that fill up and make up the lung tissue. And the diaphragm is the muscle that separates your abdominal cavity from your thoracic cavity housing your lungs and your heart. And that is the major muscle that when it contracts is in charge of causing you to breathe in. So it's the major muscle of respiration or ventilation. So we'll start from the top and work our way through. What you used to call nostrils, which are the holes at in the tip of your nose, at the end of your nose. Now that you're an anatomist, you no longer will call those nostrils, you'll call those nares. And then the nasal cavity is actually divided into two separate channels by the nasal septum. And the nasal septum is actually a bone that goes down the middle of your nose. So when someone says they broke their nose, this is the bone that they're talking about. They're talking about their nasal septum. And there can be a medical condition called deviated septum, where that bone that goes down the middle of the nose is curved or bent. It's not straight, and that's called a deviated septum. And if the curvature or the bend is significant enough, it can actually interfere with breathing. And so that's when that happens, the doctor may recommend surgery to repair the deviated septum so that it's straight, uh, like the normal septum. So then the last term here, nasal cavity. The nasal cavity is the cavity, meaning cave, or any air or space in the nose. From the side view, it would be the space opening up from the nares, and in the anterior view, it would be any space between your outer skin and the septum. So that's all considered nasal cavity. So inside the nasal cavity, there's some structures of note. One is the olfactory receptors. These are located in the mucosa. Remember, the mucosa is the skin that makes up the inner ring of the donut that is our body. And it's, instead of being dry and hard, it is soft and moist and covered in mucus. That's why it's called mucosa. So they're olfactory receptors, which are a part of our special senses that bind with chemicals to send smell signals to our brain, are located in the superior surface of our nasal cavity. So they're on the roof of that cavity. And if you remember from our special senses lecture, the cells actually had projections that went through the bone of the roof of our nasal cavity that were in the mucus so that they could bind to the chemicals that travel in through your nares, through the nasal cavity, and to those olfactory receptors. Now, if we have the body of the receptor here and a projection coming through to the nasal cavity, that means the bone in the roof of the nasal cavity has to have holes. So this section of bone in your skull between where the body of the olfactory receptor is and where the projection is that has holes in it is actually called the cribriform plate. And so the cribriform plate, if you look at it from on top, would look like this, and it would have little holes in it where the sensing projections of the olfactory receptors poke through. And remember that the mucosa is lined with mucus, produces mucus, which one of the functions of that mucus is to trap incoming foreign particles, so dust, dirt, debris, in order to help filter the air before we bring it all the way down into our lungs. We also have structures called concha, and what the concha are they look like airline wings on the side of a plane. If you were looking at them from the front, and here we can see them from the lateral view. These are the wings of the concha. They actually stick out sideways like a wing, and what they have two major functions. One is to increase the surface area of the mucosa, right? Instead of it just being a flat wall straight up and down, it has these wings or shelves that are covered all the way out and back in with mucosa, which means we're increasing the surface area of the mucus and mucosas so that they trap additional foreign particles. It's like having a bigger filter. And then the second is, because the reason I use the term wings is the other thing that the concha do is they increase air turbulence. So if you can think about what turbulence means on an airplane, when they say we're experiencing turbulence, the airplane starts to shake, right? That means the air gets bumpy. So what the concha do as the air comes in through your nares into your nasal cavity, it encounters the concha, and that actually causes the air to stir, to swirl around, and essentially slows down the air before it can make its way down through the airway into your lungs. And what this does is it causes the air to spend more time. So instead of spending a quarter of a second, the air spends a half a second going across all the mucosa in your nasal cavity allowing, again, for the mucosa to trap more particles, to be a better filter of the air. Secondly, we have what are called the hard and soft palate. So the palate separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. So you've probably heard of hard and soft palate before, but in reference to your mouth. So we're talking about it now. It separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity. And the hard palate is actually the anterior part. So the hard palate is the anterior portion of the palate. And the soft palate is the posterior portion of the palate. Okay, so the palate is that barrier between your nasal cavity and oral cavity. And the hard palate and soft palate are different, yes, because one is hard and one is soft, but also by position. The hard palate is anterior, and the soft palate is posterior. Okay, so in addition to the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, we actually have several other cavities in our skull, and these cavities are called sinuses. And so when you get a cold, when you get the flu, you may get a headache, or you may feel pressure in your forehead and around your nose, and that's because the sinuses in your skull fill with mucus and become inflamed when you have a cold or a flu that makes sick. And so we actually name these sinuses based on their position in the skull. So we have the frontal sinus, which is here, and that's actually in your frontal bone. Then we have the ethmoid sinus, which is actually behind, oh, let me get a different color. We have the ethmoid sinus, which is actually right here in the middle, directly between your eyes underneath the frontal sinus, and that's in your sphenoid sinus. Then you have the those are your ethmoid sinuses in your ethmoid bone. So let's fix that. Okay, your ethmoid sinus. It's still these sinuses here, and those are in your ethmoid bone. The sinuses that are in the sphenoid bone are actually difficult to view in this from this anterior view. They're actually deep to these other sinuses, but we also have the maxillary sinuses, which are here, and they're in your cheekbones, and your cheekbones are actually, the anatomic name is maxillary bone. So the function of these sinuses, again, is to produce mucus, and this mucus is actually drains into your nasal cavity. So the mucus is produced here and here in your frontal sinus and ethmoid sinus, and in your maxillary sinus, and then all that mucus is drained into your nasal cavity, and that's to help wash out that dust debris that you're filtering out from the air in your nose. So, and another function is your skull's actually all bone, and it's quite heavy, which is why we need necks to hold our head up. But these sinuses are hollow, so they help to lighten the weight of the skull. And they also act as resonance chambers for speech. So if you've ever used like a megaphone, but the old school megaphone before they had speakers and amplifiers, the old megaphones were really just cones. right? And someone would hold the cone to their mouth, and that's because the cone would act as a resonance chamber, and it would amplify or increase the volume of what the speaker was saying. So the sinuses act as resonance chambers, natural as natural megaphones for our speech. So the pharynx, moving on from the nose, the pharynx is what you think of as your throat. But now you know it's called pharynx because you're an anatomist. And so next time you're at a party and someone says, "Oh, I got a tickle in the back of the throat," one, say, cover your mouth and get out of here because you're about to share a upper respiratory infection with the rest of us. But also, it's not called throat, it's called pharynx. And then they may not be friends with you, but at least you had fun at the party. So it's actually behind uh, the nasal cavity and oral cavity. So here's the nasal cavity, here's the oral cavity. It's actually behind the cavity and makes up the beginning of the tube that takes the air down to your lungs. So the pharynx is the overall structure. So this is all pharynx, but we actually divide the pharynx into 3 regions or zones. So the first is the nasopharynx, which is, of course, behind the nasal cavity. Then we have the oropharynx, which is behind your oral cavity. Okay, so there's a pattern there. And then you have the laryngopharynx, which is behind your larynx. So we haven't talked about the larynx yet, but the larynx is the anatomy term for your voice box. So if you can remember and look at laryngopharynx, oropharynx, and nasopharynx, the names actually tell you what region of the pharynx we're talking about based on the structure that's in front of it, the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, or the larynx. So what is the larynx? Let's talk about that. So there's 4 parts or 3 parts that you want to talk about with the larynx. So first is the epiglottis. The epiglottis is actually a flap or a door that opens and closes. Okay, so that between your trachea and esophagus. So you actually have 2 tubes that go from your nose and your mouth down into your thoracic and abdominal cavities. So one is carrying air, that's your trachea, and the other is carrying food, so that's your esophagus. So you don't want food going into your lungs, and you don't want your stomach filling with air. So your body has a switch which detects which one is coming in, and it switches open or closed based on where we want that air or food to go. And so that switch is called the epiglottis. You also in your larynx have what's called thyroid. It's made up of thyroid cartilage, which is the largest of the hyaline cartilages, and is protrudes out in front of the larynx. So you remember on the skeleton, right? We had the skeleton. That's a very bad skeleton. Okay, then we had the ribs, right? And then the arms. And we had the neck, but right underneath the skull, in front of the cervical vertebrae, there was a little U-shaped bone. Okay, and that's where your thyroid cartilage is as well, and that makes up what people call your Adam's apple. Okay, so that's the party word, Adam apple, but the anatomist word is thyroid cartilage and hyoid bone. So the vocal folds are what actually make up what people call your voice box. And they're literal folds in your larynx. They make up a triangle. If you're looking at it, if we cut through the larynx sideways, and then we look down from the top, you would see, and your vocal folds are closed, you would see it would look like this, and then when they're open, it would look like this, okay? And those are your vocal folds. And what actually happens the way you speak is you push air up through these folds, and they vibrate, right? Just like a guitar string vibrates to generate sound, the way you speak is the exact same. These vocal folds vibrate, which causes vibrations in the air that we call sound waves. And the glottis is the opening between the vocal cords. So this space, just like in a blood vessel, the space inside the walls of the artery is called the lumen. In the vocal folds, in the larynx, the space between the vocal folds is called the glottis. Okay, so the epiglottis and the glottis are different. So don't get those two confused, and you'll be all right. So that is all of those structures: the nose, the larynx, the pharynx, and the three regions of the pharynx. Those are all considered your upper respiratory system. Okay, so when you get a what you call a head cold, right, where your sinuses get congested and the back of your throat gets tender and sore, and you get really snotty, those are all what we call upper respiratory infections. So before the test, quiz yourself, try and label this chart with all the different structures, so without looking to see what you know and what you don't know, and try and go through that a few times until you can label all the structures without checking. And then here's the answer sheet to compare yourself to make sure you got it right. Okay, so now we're continuing to move down the airway. So the next is the trachea, or the windpipe. This is a 4-inch long tube that connects the larynx with the bronchi. Okay, so the air comes in. It comes in through our nares, through our nasal cavity. It also comes in through our mouth. And then the epiglottis, right, blocks our esophagus because we don't want to swallow air into our stomach. We want it to go into our lungs, so it passes through the larynx where our vocal folds are. So the glottis has to be open or closed. Right, open. We need the air to get through. And it travels down this pipe, which is below the larynx. So that pipe below the larynx, where the air travels, is called the trachea. Before you were an anatomist, you would probably call it a windpipe, but now you know it's a trachea. So a cool thing about the trachea is that the walls of the trachea are reinforced with a C-shaped hyaline cartilage. Okay, we'll talk about that more in the next slide, what that means. But basically, around 3/4, if we cut the trachea and we look at it from the top, you'll see that 3/4 of the trachea is actually lined by cartilage, right? And cartilage is the bendy but hard stuff that makes up the tip of our nose and our ears. And so it's softer than bone, but it's still fairly strong and rigid, but it's somewhat flexible. And this is done to protect our air pipe. And this would be the front or anterior, and this is the back or the posterior. So that helps, that is the C-shaped hyaline cartilage that reinforces or protects the trachea. Another protection that we use in the trachea are called ciliated mucosa. So we talked about mucosa, but so what is ciliated mucosa? So ciliated mucosa is still the same. It's the soft, moist inner skin of the donut that makes up our body.
But the ciliated mucosa means it has cilia. They have little projections, or they look like hairs. They're not hair at all, but they look like hair or fur. They're little tiny projections that come out the top of the mucosa cell. So if here's the mucosa cells that line your trachea, this is what they look like in your nasal cavity, in your oral cavity, even in your pharynx. But in your trachea, they get these cilia. Okay, and they're like fingers, not hair. They're more like fingers, and the reason is that the the cilia, they sweep back and forth, and they carry. Remember, the purpose of mucosa is to use that mucus to trap dust, dirt, debris, even if there's virus or bacteria in the air. We want them to get trapped in that mucus of the mucosa. And what the trachea does with the cilia, the fingers, is they sweep back and forth and actually help push all that gunk that's trapped in the mucus back up and out. So if you ever, when you get a little sick, sometimes you do what's called coughing up phlegm. And that's literally because the cilia in your trachea are pushing that dirty mucus back up into your pharynx, or the back of your throat. And then through your oropharynx, you can feel it clog up, and then you cough, and that air pushes that dirty mucus back out. So this is a picture of that C-shaped hyaline cartilage. Okay, this is the esophagus. This is obviously after the epiglottis, so food goes down here, but we don't care about that. We're talking about respiration today. So the air goes in the lumen of the trachea, and this is the front, the anterior, so this is where your nose and your eyes are facing. Okay, and so we have this flexible or rubber protection. Why do you think we need that extra protection from impact around our trachea? Right, well, it's in our neck, and our neck is relatively exposed, right? It doesn't have the same bony protections that our brain has in our skull, or that our lungs and heart have in our ribs. But our neck needs to be able to move, because we have to swivel our head up and down and all around to watch for threats. So it can't be rigid like with the ribs, but we still need protection, because if we damage our trachea, then all the air will come rushing out and will not get to our lungs, and will suffocate and die. So we have this extra ring, this C-shaped ring of hyaline cartilage. Okay, so I've spent 4 minutes talking about the trachea on 2 different slides. It will probably be a test question. Just a hint. Okay, so moving on from the trachea, we're going to next talk about the primary bronchi. So what are the bronchi? So here is the trachea. It's that one tube that goes from your larynx and brings the air down through your ribs into your cavity, direct where it can be pushed into the lungs. So this one tube is the trachea. So the primary bronchi is that first branch on each side that branches from the trachea. So this is your right primary bronchus. This is your left primary bronchus. And bronchus is singular. So, and then primary bronchi is referring to both your right and left bronchus together. And one thing to note, that your right primary bronchus is shorter and straighter than your left. And this is because, so your right is shorter and straighter than your left. Okay, so why? Well, what makes up this space right here? It's your heart. And remember, your heart is mostly in the center, but also the base of the heart does extend onto the left side of your thoracic cavity, which means it encroaches on the lung on the left side. So your left primary bronchus has to curve and go around the space that your heart takes up. Versus on the right side, where there's no heart, we see 1, 2, 3 lobes, because that space can be taken up by lung tissue. Versus on the left side, where your heart essentially, from a available space perspective, takes up the space of 1 lobe. So your left lung has only 1, 2 lobes. So what does your primary bronchi look like going into the lobes of the lung? So here, just to orient you, here's that right primary bronchus coming from the trachea, branching off the trachea into the lung, and here's the left primary bronchus. Okay, so we've sliced a transverse plane through the body, through the thoracic cavity, and now we're looking at it from the bottom, but
from the top.
And we see this one main branch is where the primary bronchus starts and stops. So actually, if you look closely, you'll see that the air. Oh, I need a better color. The airways continue to branch off. Okay, so we see a branch there, a branch there, a branch there. Same on this side. The primary bronchus has branches off of it. Okay, those branches are called secondary bronchi, because primary is 1, secondary is 2. And there we go, just to be consistent. So that's the primary bronchi, that's the secondary bronchi. What's a good color? Let's do purple. Then we have what are called tertiary bronchi. So those are the branches that come off the secondary bronchi. Okay, and on and on and on we have these branches. So off the secondary bronchi are tertiary bronchi. Okay. So each level of branch gets smaller, and as we go, we have the trachea, then the first 2 branches off the trachea are the primary bronchi, then the branches that come directly off the primary bronchi are called, by that definition, are called secondary bronchi, and then the branches that come off the secondary bronchi are by definition called tertiary bronchi. So we can see this pattern here. They call them tree divisions, right? Because it kind of looks like if you put a tree on its side and here is the grass, it kind of looks like a tree, right? Just like a tree brings up water and nutrients from the ground up through its main trunk and through many branches. Our lungs use that same pattern of organization. So on the test, I won't point to a secondary bronchi or tertiary bronchi and ask you to identify them just by like an arrow. But I do want you to understand the concepts of how they're defined. I may ask you in a worded question, what does the secondary bronchi branch off of? And the correct answer would be primary bronchi, and tertiary bronchi may be a choice on your test as a distractor. So just understand those concepts. But actually, that's not the end of the branching of the passageways. Okay, so they keep getting smaller and smaller. And the reason they're called bronchi and not alveoli is all of these primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi, and they get even smaller than that. The next level is bronchiole, just like artery. The next lower version of artery was arterial, same idea. And then we have terminal bronchiole, so we're getting close to the end. And then off of that, we have respiratory bronchioles. Okay, so we can't see in this picture, well, we can only see down to the tertiary level, maybe a couple bronchioles. So let's look at what we're talking about. Oh, and then you continue, once you get microscopic, then from the bronchioles, there are branches called alveolar ducts. Remember, duct is like an air duct in the ceiling. It's a hollow tube that transports something, in this case air. Then you have alveolar sac, which are clusters of alveoli. Okay, and that's what this micrograph is showing. It's showing an alveolar sac, which is a cluster of alveoli. Okay, remember, alveoli is where the air is exchanged with the outside environment and our blood. Okay, so this is showing you a breakdown. Okay, we have the terminal bronchiole, right? So we had primary bronchiole, well, we have the trachea, primary bronchiole, secondary bronchiole, tertiary bronchiole, then we had, or bronchi, then we had the bronchiole, then we have the terminal bronchiole, then we have the respiratory bronchioles, then we have the alveolar ducts. Okay, so these are the alveolar ducts. This is an alveolar duct. You can barely see it, but it's underneath. There's an alveolar duct. There's an alveolar duct. Okay, and then the alveolar sac is a cluster of individual alveoli. So that's an alveoli, that's an alveoli, that's an alveoli. So it's like a tree at where the alveoli are the leaves or the berries. Okay. So once we get to the level of the respiratory bronchioles, every branch after that, so after here, is considered the respiratory zone. Okay. And if the respiratory zone includes the respiratory bronchiole, the alveolar duct, the alveolar sac, and the alveoli. So if we take this alveolar sac and we zoom in and cut it open, we can see here's the alveolar duct. This whole thing is the alveolar sac, and then here's an alveoli, here's an alveoli, and here's an alveoli. And where does the gas exchange, this is a critical question, okay, where does the gas exchange actually happen? So just like in our cardiovascular system, the exchange of nutrients and blood cells only happens through the capillaries in the capillary bed, right? The arteries and the veins and the arterioles and venules actually are made to not leak because they need to transport the blood to where it goes. So the only place where the actual exchange of blood and fluid happens in the cardiovascular system is in the capillary bed. So this is a very similar pattern where the air actually travels through all of the structures that we've talked to so far, upper respiratory system, all the way down to the alveolar duct, and that whole time the air is just traveling. There's no exchange. So the gas exchange only happens through the membrane of an alveoli. Now it happens through all the alveoli, but only through the alveoli. Okay? Gas exchange only happens through the membranes of the alveoli. Okay? And so in the alveoli, since that's the only place where that exchange happens, we have what we call an air-blood barrier, or the respiratory membrane. So we have defenses, our last line of defense, before we bring whatever's in the air into our body. And we have two major defenses that are part of the respiratory membrane, air-blood barrier, in our alveoli. One is surfactant. So this is like mucus, but you can imagine the mucus in our throat, in our mouth, and our nose does not allow any air to pass through. It's too thick. It's too viscous. So what surfactant is it's a more watery or fluid version of mucus, which helps trap that last bit of debris, and it also acts to maintain the surface tension between the sacs so that they don't collapse as the pressure changes as you breathe. We also have the other defense that make up our air-blood barrier in the alveoli are macrophages. So the macrophages are cells, part of our immune defense, if you remember from our lymph lecture, that put around the alveoli and eat up whatever debris is caught in the surfactant. Okay. If they find a little piece of dust, they come and they surround it and eat it and take it in, chop it up and dispose of it. Okay, so we have two cell types in our alveoli that help with our final line of defense. So one is macrophage, that's a cell, and then surfactant, which is actually produced by a surfactant secreting cell. Okay. That's explaining that. So, how does the exchange actually happen? So the respiratory membrane is actually made up of two different membranes that are fused. Okay, so we have the membrane of the alveoli. So this is the alveoli. Okay, so this is that little bubble, that little air-filled grape that is once the air comes in through our mouth and our nose, goes down the trachea through the tree-like system of bronchi and bronchioles, and finally makes it to the alveoli. That membrane of the alveoli makes up the alveolar epithelium. And then on the other side, we have our capillary. So this is bringing blood from the heart into the lungs, and brings the capillaries line up and connect with the alveoli by fusing the two membranes. So the capillary endothelium, or membrane of the capillary, and the alveolar epithelium fuse to make up the respiratory membrane. So from here to here, from here to here, this thickness, that's the respiratory membrane. And then what happens is that this is the exact place of gas exchange. So the O2 comes in from the air through the respiratory membrane and is picked up by a red blood cell in the capillary, and the red blood cell donates CO2 back into the alveoli, so that when we exhale, that CO2 is now pushed through the exact same tract up through our bronchioles, through our the branches of the bronchi, through the trachea, through the pharynx, out through the nose and mouth. So what are the functions? This is the function of the respiratory system. This is the whole point. Oxygen is vital and critical for all the tissues in our body to stay alive, and which is why it's delivered by the blood system, because the blood system provides nutrients and oxygen to all tissues in our entire body. Okay, so we'll back up a little bit and talk about how does breathing work. So first, we need to understand the main structure of the lung. So that's the final discussion of the airway. So this is the lung. So the apex is this top little pointy part of the lung. The base of the lung is this flat part in the inferior edge, or the bottom of the lung. Both the right and left lung have lobes. So just like our brain had lobes, where the lobes are connected, but there's kind of like a fissure or fold or a dent that creates a natural separation. So we in this one we see one lobe that starts at the apex and goes all the way down to this fissure, and then the second lobe goes from the fissure to the base, and so we have two lobes. So is this the right lobe or the left lobe? What do you think? Well, if you remember a couple slides ago, what did we say took up this space right here in the middle between? It was the heart, right? And so the heart, from a space perspective, acts like a third lobe. So this would be the left lobe, because you can see the heart is taking up space, leaving only space for two lobes. Okay, so now we can see the right lung. So they are just called left lung and right lung. Okay, so the right lung has 1, 2, 3 lobes. And because it has 3 lobes, that means it has 2 fissures, not just one. So since we have 2 fissures, we name the fissures. So the superior fissure is called the horizontal fissure, and that's because compared to the other fissure, it's more horizontal. And then this fissure between the second and third lobe is at more of an angle. And so the anatomy word for diagonal is oblique. Okay, so this is the oblique fissure and the horizontal fissure. And so that makes the right upper lobe, the right middle lobe, which is between the two fissures, and the right lower lobe, which is below the oblique fissure. So what are the events of respiration? Okay, so we have 2 categories of breathing. So respiration is kind of the general word for breathing, now that you're a physiologist. Okay, but we actually, when we get technical, there's actually 2 different terms, ventilation and respiration. So ventilation means moving air. Okay, so that's just breathe in and out. The fact that we moved air in and out is just called ventilation, right? Movement of air. So in your hot, stuffy room, you say, oh, we need to vent the air, meaning we need to move this hot, stuffy air out of our room. Okay, but respiration, as a technical term, actually specifically refers to gas exchange. So ventilation on its own is just referring to moving air, but the actual process of gas exchange is not included in that definition. That's what we call, that's the definition of respiration. Again, oxygen is loaded into the blood, carbon dioxide is unloaded from the blood so we can expel it into the environment. So how does inspiration happen? So inspiration or inhalation means breathing the air in. Okay, so here's your hint, in. Okay, inspiration is the inward part of respiration. Okay. So how does that happen? What happens is your diaphragm, that big muscle at the bottom of your thoracic cavity, is actually connected to the base of your lungs. And muscles can only contract, right? So when this muscle flexes, it only moves one way. And the way it moves is down. When the diaphragm contracts, it moves down. So if your apexes of your lungs are anchored at the top, they're anchored, they don't move. So if your diaphragm pulls down, do your lungs get bigger or smaller? Your lungs get bigger, right? So once the diaphragm, which is attached to the base, pulls down, the space of your lung actually gets bigger. So your lung is actually stretchy. So when you breathe in, that you're consciously contracting this skeletal muscle of your diaphragm downward, and it makes the lung bigger. But right when you first start making that lung bigger, for that first second, that first part of a second, there's the same amount of air in the lung as the nanosecond before it. But now there's more space with the same amount of air. And so that means that relative pressure of air in the lungs, as the lungs get bigger, the pressure goes down. And actually, the pressure in the lungs gets lower than what we call atmospheric pressure, or the pressure of air all around us. So as the lungs expand, the pressure inside the lung falls below the level of just the regular pressure of air around us all the time. And so that because of the principles of diffusion, right, where we have high concentration naturally moves to areas of low concentration, this high pressure of air outside our body rushes in through our nose and mouth, down our upper respiratory system, through our airways, and into our lungs. Okay, so when you breathe in, you're not sucking in air as in you're making the air come in. You're creating a low pressure environment inside the lung, and the high pressure outside your body naturally, through the natural forces of physics and chemistry, naturally rush into your body because of that low pressure that you created. Okay. So expiration, or pushing the air out, expiration, which is the out of respiration or ventilation, is the opposite. It's the exact opposite. Okay, so remember, skeletal muscle can only contract and relax, but it can't contract two ways. So what happens for expiration is that you have just finished inspiration. So your diaphragm is down here, and then your diaphragm relaxes. And when your diaphragm relaxes, it returns to its original position, which means the base of the lungs, which are attached to the diaphragm, return upward to their normal relaxed shape. Which means for that first nanosecond, that first half a second that the lungs are getting smaller, you still have a same amount of air in your lungs, but now in a smaller space. So that makes the pressure in your lung go up. And eventually the pressure in your lung gets higher than the pressure of the environment, of the air around you. And again, we have that natural law. Once the pressure in your lung is higher than the pressure in the air, which we would now call low, although it hasn't changed, but relative to the pressure in your lung, it is now lower, then that causes the natural physics of air to try and equalize that pressure, to make that pressure even. And so air rushes out until the pressure in our lungs matches the pressure outside. So that's expiration. So we can actually listen with a stethoscope to that process to see if you're breathing. So we call that listening respiratory sounds. So your doctor or nurse will use your stethoscope for two reasons. One is to listen to your heart, and they put these go in your ears, and then this goes over the part of their body you're listening to. So if they're listening to your heart, it goes over your heart, and actually they put it directly over the valves, because that's the valves closing, snapping closed is what makes the heart sound. But for your lungs, they put them over the lobes of your lung, and they actually will listen to each lobe separately. So if you have a good doctor, they'll put it on you and ask you to breathe in and out, and then they'll move it and ask you to breathe in and out again, and then move it and ask you to breathe in and out again, and then move it, ask you to breathe in and out again, and then move it and ask you to breathe in and out again, because they're trying to listen to all the different lobes, because the lobes are separate. But what they're listening for are two things. One is bronchial sounds. So they're trying to listen to the air as it rushes through the airway, right? There's tubes that bring the air into your lungs. And they want to make sure that it sounds clear. If there's debris or irritation, they actually can hear what sounds like wheezing, but it's since it's not in your pharynx or your throat, you don't hear it because it's just in these tubes in your lungs. But with the stethoscope, if they're inflamed or damaged, they can hear wheezing through these bronchial sounds. So they're literally listening to the trachea and the bronchi, the tubes that carry air. The other sounds they're listening for are called vesicular breathing sounds. And this is where they try and listen to see if the air is filling the alveoli normally. And so what they'll hear, if the alveoli, remember those are the little grapes at the end of the alveolar ducts, right? If there's damage to the alveoli, they'll hear crunching. Okay, it sounds like chewing on chips or stomping, like stomping on grapes. So what they don't want a healthy respiratory sounds is nothing. It's just, you just hear the air flowing like the wind. But if they hear wheezing or crunching, that means that your bronchial sounds are indicating some sort of pathological state in your trachea, bronchi, or alveoli. Okay, so another clinical correlation is hyperventilation and hypoventilation. So hyperventilation results when you have too much CO2 in your blood. And this results in your blood becoming acidic. And that's bad. Remember, your blood needs to maintain a very narrow range of its pH. Just like your pool has to be in the right range of pH, your blood has to be in the right range of pH for your body to function. So if you get too much CO2 traveling around in your blood, it actually causes your blood to become too acidic. And so what happens is your body starts causing you to breathe rapidly, so faster and deeper. So that's that. And the reason that we are doing that is obviously gas exchanges with each breath cycle. So we have inspiration where we bring the air in, and expiration where we bring the air out. And when we expire, we're pushing CO2 out into the environment. So what we want to do by hyperventilating is by speeding up this process, we start pushing a lot of CO2 out into the environment and out of our body so that we can restore our body out of that acidotic state back to a normal state. Okay, so hyper means excess, too much, right? Like Charlie's a little hyper today. So hyperventilation means you start breathing in excess, so rapid and deep, but really you're trying to blow out the extra or hyper CO2. So hypoventilation is the opposite. Hypo means not enough. Okay, so what happens is if you don't have enough CO2 in your blood, it becomes alkalotic or suffers from alkalosis, a state where the pH is out of balance, but in the opposite direction. And that's also not good. So what we do is we slow our breathing so that CO2 can build up in our blood and we're not expelling it as quickly. And by building up CO2 to that appropriate range, then we can restore homeostasis to our blood with its oxygen and CO2 balance. So again, what to review for the exam? All anatomy definitions and terms, and obviously be able to ID it on a table. Physiology, definitions, terms, functions. So try and, when we write the questions, I like to ask questions that show if you understand the concept of the function and using the correct terms, okay? And then clinical correlations, we just went over those. Those are the respiratory sounds, hyperventilation, hypoventilation, and the deviated septum in the nose. And then, of course, all diagrams, tables, figures, and charts and images are considered testable and are really what I highly recommend you make your summary sheets focused on diagrams, tables, and charts, because you can include all of these other elements on these diagrams, tables, and charts, which is why we use them. All right, thanks. Remember to fill in the blanks and submit that PowerPoint. You can either print it out and write on it and scan it, or just type the answers into a PowerPoint and submit it through Canvas. Also do the lab activity, the virtual lab activity that's posted in the module. And then the summary sheet for this lecture is due, and all of that's due Wednesday. So it's normally due Monday, but because of the holiday, it'll be due Wednesday, November 30th. Thanks, and enjoy your weekend.